one. Okay, we're live. Georgie Dinkov, Raymond Peat, thank you guys so much for joining us. Georgie, go back to your question. I won't interfere. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's an expansion to what we've been discussing, but aside from, say, Otto Warburg, St. Georgi, and, say, I guess, Ilya Prigogine, do you know of any other scientists who got the Nobel Prize for actually humanistic work, for work that expanded knowledge and science for the benefit of humanity, or does it seem to be mostly awarded for pathological ideas these days?
Mechnikov.
Mechnikov, okay.
Yeah.
But that seems to be like, you can count these people on one hand, and they've been, Nobel winners across 100 years. So this means a very small minority of good awards, the vast majority of them being mostly pathological discoveries.
Yeah, and Mechnikov shared his with Paul Ehrlich, who represented the business monopoly, chemical monopoly world.
Right. Are you familiar with the work of Luc Montagnier, the co-discoverer of HIV?
Yeah, I've followed it, not in detail, but on and off since about 1980.
Have you noticed, that he's become a pariah in the scientific community because he started talking about HIV being not really as dangerous unless you have a bad lifestyle and, low metabolism, essentially. He's talking about curing autism with antibiotics, which of course implicates serotonin. And this guy is now gone. He used to be the director of the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And I think now he hides. He's in hiding. He used to be in Africa. Now he's in China. But nobody really knows where he is. And everybody says he's insane.
It's much later, but when Peter Duesberg questioned, he sort of started the virus gene connection in cancer, and money began flowing from the government into cancer research, and then he said, well, "Wait a minute, I was mistaken there," and went on to other work, and as long as he stayed out of the direct interfering with the funding of the nonsense oncogene virus work, he continued his research. But then when he questioned whether the HIV retrovirus caused AIDS, that was the last straw, and he even the other professors at the university told graduate students not to attend his seminars or courses, and NIH cut off funding. All of the science organizations stopped inviting him because he would be a threat. The risk of asking embarrassing questions. Have you heard Carrie Mullis talk about Luc Montagnier and Peter Duesberg?
No, I haven't.
He was sort of a hyperactive kid who went into science and didn't let his intelligence be ruined by getting trained in science, and so he continued to look at evidence and ask questions. And once he went up to Montagnier at a meeting and said he needed a reference. He was writing a grant. Said he needed a reference for this statement. HIV is the probable cause of AIDS, and Montagnier referred him to the declaration by the NIH that in fact it is the cause. And Carrie Mullis said, well, but there was no evidence mentioned there. And so Montagnier said, well, recently someone showed that by treating a retrovirus in a certain way, you could get it to kill chimpanzees in a week after you inject it. And Mullis pointed out that that has nothing to do with immunodeficiency syndrome. And he said Montagnier just walked away. No more questions.
Well,
it's becoming too dangerous for him to speak, right?
Yeah, but then 30 years later, the science world turned away from him.
Yeah. Have you seen some of his other work on bacteria and DNA being emitting electromagnetic waves and changing the structure of water?
Yeah. I haven't looked closely at how they pick up the signals and analyze it, but they say that they're getting signals, sort of an echo in the water, which if people don't challenge it, you have to approximate the measuring system before you can say it simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, he was actually able to replicate the HIV virus across two different containers of serum. And the second one didn't have any, but it was in close proximity, didn't have any traces of the virus. And he confirmed this with a PCR test. But if the second container was in close proximity to the one that contained the virus, and both of them were in a resonating field of the Schumann resonance frequency, which I think is between 6 and 10 hertz, the Earth apparently emits it, then apparently after about 12 hours, he could actually prove that the second container was able to fully replicate the virus if you give it the starting materials. Like if you give it like an RNA and the actual enzyme, I guess DNA polymerase, is that what it's called?
Yeah. That sort of thing has been around. I think it was in 1940. Someone was adding proteins to different types of cells and finding that the cell could replicate and the offspring would still contain that protein, and they would do it for several generations. And one of these was showing that with extreme techniques for removing any contaminating protein, that they would calculate the amount of protein coming out of the cell, and it would be thousands of times greater than the amount of protein the cell had been exposed to, a foreign protein. And very clear evidence that on a single exposure, a human cell could absorb and copy and produce unlimited quantities of a foreign protein, meaning that it had not only copied DNA, it had translated the protein into RNA or DNA, and then used the nucleic acid to produce endless quantities of that protein. The amount after 100 generations or so, they said, would be thousands of tons of starting material if it had been a matter of absorption and dilution.
Okay. Here's a follow-up fascinating question related to that. We as bodies are essentially, bigger replicas of these containers that Montagnier was using. If two people, one of them HIV positive or carrying any other virus or pathogen really for that matter, are in close proximity for a sufficiently long period of time, and we're all bathing in Schumann resonance all the time because that's what the Earth emits, as electromagnetic frequency. Wouldn't that imply that we could potentially replicate the infection into a healthy person without any actual physical pathogen, exchanging places? So there's no need for direct infection.
But I think it works the other way, that the healthy person is going to give the sick person a boost to
right.
eradicate the problem. I think that's how life has been working all along. Bacteria act a little particle of new DNA that they created to make them immune to something in the environment, such as an antibiotic, to pass it on to other bacteria to replicate and protect themselves. And whether it requires passing a chunk of DNA or simply the information needed to make the DNA protein, I think the protective healing effect is likely to be predominant unless the whole system is so sick that it's on the way to dying as a whole.
Right. So would you say it's a sort of like an averaging effect? So if you have more healthy organisms in a community, and then let's say like you have 5 organisms, 3 are healthy, 2 are sick, then on average you'll have like, I don't know, 3/5 of a health per 3/5 of a healthy person per person. I mean, I know I'm simplifying it, but because I'm tying this to Kammerer's work on seriality and how systems tend to approximate each other and imitate each other. So the whole community tends toward like a similarity or an average of a sorts. So would you say that there will be like a slight decline in the health of the healthy person and a boost in the sick one, or is it strictly a one-directional thing where the healthy people are pulling the sick towards health? And it's just it's just a matter of the number of the healthy people you have.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a ratchet on it in the direction of surviving healthy and superior individuals.
Okay.
And it requires a sickness of the whole community before you get regression.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking this is because I'm sure, and actually you've said it in several interviews, that we should try to surround ourselves with healthy, positively minded people, and that, certain people can be really toxic, which leads me to another question I'll ask later on. But so if a healthy person is more or less, I don't want to say immune, but if it's the sick people that benefit, then there shouldn't be a danger really if we're surrounded by sick, negatively minded people, or is there another mechanism through which they can hurt our health?
I don't think so. If they're if you have, for example, a geographic area where sick people have accumulated because of some cultural habits like drug use, then you can have such a sick environment that it would take a big infusion of healthy people, and there would be social, political conflict between the people with the unhealthy culture. You have to look at the number of people supporting an unhealthy culture, and the number of people running around obediently wearing masks and behaving stupidly. It reaches a point where it feels like it's bad for one's health.
Well, speaking of that, I was, last time we did this, I was in a smaller town called Peat, and we came to Chiang Mai, which is like a bigger city in Thailand. And to get to the good grocery store, you have to go into a mall. And so you have to like put a QR code. Right now, I think it's kind of voluntary, but you're expected to do it. A QR code, wash your hands, which I don't do, get temperature checked, and then be screened by like a thermal scanner. And that's just to get into the mall. And then there's guards on, there's people watching people from each level of the mall. And then to get into the grocery store, you're expected to also do a QR code and to write your name down and to get temperature checked. And so, yeah, it's definitely hitting like a reality check point of just total insanity. And then also, I didn't wear my mask, or I wore it and then took it off when I got into the store. And a woman chased me throughout the store to tell me to put it back on. And so I could see how a non-crazy person might be okay with that, but it definitely reduces. It makes me crazy, you know, and so. It's hard to handle, for sure. Ray, you guys, both of you guys, DC is, sorry, go ahead, Ray.
What was the?
Oh, no question, just many statements. But it was just a realization because the Peat town was very small and they didn't have these orders to do this kind of stuff. And then coming to the bigger city was a realization of what life was going like. I guess the TSA-ification of daily tasks. And and the TSA is one situation where it makes my blood pressure go up like through the roof. And so that just sounds like a terrible life and fits into that killer austerity idea that we've been talking about a lot.
Yeah, the even when people are alone walking down a tree-lined street with no one within 200 feet, wearing a mask in hot weather, obviously suffer. I don't know, pitiful or something to see such terrible obedience.
Well, don't worry, Ray, because apparently the experts say that protests of up to 100 people are okay, but social outdoor gatherings of only up to 12 people. And then, yes, so, I mean, aren't they? Is the population so dumb? Like, this is an obvious showing of the hand or something because it's so absurd. But what do you think? What do you think the point of them even putting this stuff out through the news is? It's like, it's so bizarre that these would be talking points on the news.
Yeah, that thing about the 100 people allowed at a protest, it shows that if people just ignore them, they'll change their rules so that they seem to be in control.
Yeah.
And since you have a broad view of these types of things, I did want to talk about like race a little bit. Like what is your, over the course of your life, what is your general perception of how racial tensions get stoked, just in your experience?
I took a couple of trips into and through the southern states, 1960 and 1964, and even though I thought of myself as being a white person, I was for some reason seen by the natives as at least as dangerous as a black person. I'm not sure what it was, but I narrowly escaped getting killed a couple of times, once on each trip, and I stayed away after the second time for about 30 years. But I saw it as just the worst sort of sadistic xenophobia. I can see why black people would shuffle and say yes. If I had thought that would have saved me, I might have tried that. But something about my face or my manner made them want to kill me.
Can you go into that a little more? Was it like, were you like protesting, or was it your friend group, or what? Like what? Yeah, go into that a little bit more. That's really interesting. They just targeted you for some unknown reason.
It must have been that I had an out-of-state driver's license and fat sideburns and probably dressed in an unconventional way. I'm not sure, but you could see the hatred emanating when I would stop at a gas station or something.
I would love to see that picture of you with the fat
can
sideburns.
we please see those?
I would pay to see that one, actually.
I talked to on those trips. I talked to only one sane person in the whole South, who was an Irishman, a motel owner, immigrant from Ireland, and somehow he was surviving there. But it was a general culture of total obedience to some mysterious standard of being.
So, speaking of since we're already on the topic of racism, do you think these protests that are going on right now are actually achieving anything, or do you think that similar in spirit to the MLK movement, because none of these people has been killed yet, we kind of know that it's really just, not that they believe they're changing things, but really no fundamental change is really happening, because if these people are really putting a dent into the system, people will start dying.
Yeah, they aren't really doing anything threatening to the system. Getting city council people to say they'll defund the police. What does that mean? That the police will incorporate, privatize, and then be autonomous? Somehow the whole system has to be broken up. Crime has to be recognized when it's committed by police. But the Nazis and Klansmen have infiltrated many of the police departments. So there is organized racism and classism, wanting to kill homeless people as well as black people.
In one of your interviews, you spoke about how the Occupy Wall Street movement could have been the real party for everybody, for the majority of the population, but it got infiltrated and manipulated away from making any real demands, and there were also snipers ready to take out the real leaders. Have you seen something similar happening with the current Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, by avoiding the general class question, making it too narrow, and things that won't get real continuous support. A lot of the people that voted for Trump had mistaken understanding about what class is and what really threatens them, and those people should be incorporated into a reform that eliminates crime in all directions, but especially obliterates the organized crime of the police forces.
Right.
Can we jump back a little bit? You were talking about the police being Klansmen and such. Has anything shifted? And I would never stick up for police. I've never met a police officer that I liked or had any positive experiences with them. But was there any kind of change? Because the dominant narrative right now is that white supremacists are the most. This paper talking about white supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. And then the basic ideas of like a white privilege or white savior complex or white guilt or white fragility, and these terms just being like I don't know, so synonymous with like activism nowadays, but it's obviously some kind of like overt racism, you know. And so again, I don't care about defending white people. I could care less, but it just seems a little bit odd that is the dominant narrative, that so-called, like, using air quotes, white people are responsible for all the problems that we're seeing nowadays.
Yeah, when Martin Luther King began emphasizing the problems of white people, almost immediately that was when he got killed. When he made it a non-racial but a class issue.
Well, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, I don't doubt that there's actual racism for sure, but like, how is that used to, I don't know, occupy the minds of people in favor of not thinking about class? And just somebody that doesn't know what class is, like, how would you define that?
Simply not possessing property, not having the social power and privilege that above the middle income in the country, people are able to think of going to college and buying a house and so on. The lower half of the population realizes, or should realize, that they are in the lower class, but they've been taught to call everyone down to about $15,000 a year income middle class. But just turning the thought process to thinking about will it be possible to have those things to get the education you want and to be secure, or will you always be struggling to rise socially? What's happening now with the pandemic is clearly designed to destroy all of those people who have thought of themselves as the middle class, and some of the actual middle class is going down as the unemployment rate goes up. Lots of small and medium-sized businesses are failing, and if traditional cyclic unemployment, if it was causing hundreds of thousands of deaths by suicide and alcoholism and drugs, imagine what the destruction of all of these businesses and jobs will do. It'll be killing millions of people.
Isn't this a bit of a, I mean, we kind of touched upon this in the last show, but isn't this a bit of a playing with fire on behalf of the powers that be? I mean, at some point, you know, a lot of people in this country are armed. If you push them into a corner, there's no telling what they will do. I mean, and there's largely no controlling them. Or do you think they're firmly under control and they will never revolt or, you know, cause another civil war or God knows what else?
The people causing their problems are have tremendous security forces. People like Fauci, you can't even get close to at a scientific meeting to ask a question. They aren't subject to force of that sort. They don't have anyone to shoot, despite how many guns they have. They're infinitely outgunned. So that sort of revolt is worse than useless.
Well, since it's already underway, do you expect sort of like a large scale kind of collapse here in the United States in the next few years?
Yep, I can't see how it can do anything but get worse until maybe if 5 or 10 million people would start rejecting orders and instructions, that might cause a movement that could save the whole country, whole world.
Right. Do you think the declining population of the young has something to do with it, with the fact that people are so obedient and willing to follow orders? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the news where they say there are studies that have come out that say that now a 30-year-old person on average has the same health or, bad health as a person who is 60 years old. So the young have become the old. There's no chronological and biological age, so have basically completely diverged. You can tell a person's biological age, in other words, health, by kind of asking them how old they are. These days, you're just as likely to find cancer in an 18-year-old as potentially in a 40-year-old, right? Do you see this as contributing to the problem?
Going in that direction, definitely.
Okay.
The allergies and systemic inflammation is becoming the worst plague, and young Americans are dying at a higher rate than most other countries from the coronavirus because of the background of extreme vaccination, use of birth control and other estrogen, SSRI, increasing serotonin exposure, all kinds of pro-inflammatory things make young people in this country a lot more vulnerable to relatively harmless viruses like the corona.
There is a horrible video floating around of like an 8-year-old boy, and his mom is holding his hand, and there's two nurses giving him multiple vaccine injections while he's screaming, and it's really one of the most disturbing things I've watched in a long time. But they only gave him 4 or 5 vaccines, but I know that they need to get many, many, many more. But it was just a video that perfectly encapsulated that process. The one last question about race, Ray, as a biologist, what is racism just like a product of a low IQ individual? Is there a biological imperative to seek out your own type of person?
No, I don't think it's biological, but going into a pure indigenous population. Sometimes I got off the road in Mexico, and I would find myself among oddly clothed indigenous people, and they didn't seem unfriendly, but they were definitely puzzled by having such a strange person there. And I think it depends on their experience as a group. If they haven't been robbed or attacked by foreigners, they just are curious and wonder why you're so different. But other groups will get together and organize some way to get rid of you. But I think that's all cultural and based on their group experience and stereotypes that have developed.
Speaking of, I want to kind of finish up the topic of the collapse. So what do you think is the end game here? Like you said before, it's a streamlined economy, so there can be better chance of competing with China. Is that what it's all about? Just competing with the new empire?
Yeah, bringing the empire rapidly to absolute world control, and China is the big massive impediment to that, and so they see China prepared to do a better job of automating everything and increasing efficiency, and so they want to hurt all of the economies and be the only ones who reach the automation through artificial intelligence, and use that along with some kind of fear to control people. There might be something other than viruses, but viruses are currently doing the job. That they'll save us with vaccines, and if vaccines don't work, then they'll require everyone to take some kind of a drug. But anything to get people obedient enough to take their treatment.
So do you think China jumped on this as an opportunity as well to even further streamline and put its own population under control? Because they must be seeing through this charade for what it is, but they seem to be going along with it, at least partially as well.
Yeah, and I think part of that is a matter of sophistication. Very few people are talking about the germ warfare thing. It briefly came out in February or March, each side accusing the other of deliberately spreading it to weaken the other's economy. But anyone who knows the actual history knows that the U.S. has been in the business for the whole 20th century, basically, and so China doesn't want to get in that competition, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the only confusing thing for me. Like, I feel like the war tension with Russia has been being stoked for a long time, and again, I could be just ignorant. But the China thing doesn't seem like they've been pushing that as hard. Like, even what was that? What Romney and Obama, and Romney said Russia was the largest threat, and Obama said the 1950s called and they wanted their foreign policy back or whatever. But like, since the Hillary and Trump in 2016, there's been like a war drum for Russia. But you're saying there's tension specifically between the U.S. and China, but also the U.S. tends to, or these certain think groups tends to praise China, how they're handling coronavirus and then implementing the changes they've made here. And so maybe it's like more of a friendly competition or something.
Who would see it as friendly?
Again, from just my ignorant point of view, you're saying it's a tension between China and the U.S. of what's happening right now. Like that's why all this stuff is happening, to maintain the dominant empire.
China's population being so huge relative to the U.S., and the U.S. population is huge relative to Russia, and so the real drift of history is strongly in the direction of China, now that they've got an efficient economy and a unified government. The population is almost a determinant of the outcome, and so extraordinary measures are needed to change that trend of history.
And then one last question on this. We might have talked about this the first time, but are things declining despite the elites doing conspiring to do these things? Like, do the elites know that there is a bad time coming ahead, therefore coronavirus, racial tension, et cetera, or is it totally manufactured by them?
I heard that Bill Gates, his income has been $1 billion a week during the lockdown. No, I think it's exactly what they want. Nothing hurts them.
So if the population is the determining factor, all other things being equal in developed economies, like let's say China, Russia, and the United States, then wouldn't it make sense for the United States, as bad as it sounds, to do something nefarious to, I don't know, decimate China's population, but prop up its own instead of decimating its own population? Or does the empire not really care about the United States as a country? It's more like a transnational cabal that can really like take a seat and can sort of
the industry went to China, and so most Americans are useless in the sense of producing profit for the financial class. And so they aren't going to lose anything if suddenly millions and millions of middle class and lower class Americans start dying off. Their income is going to accelerate for quite a while in proportion to the die-off of masses of Americans.
But if all the money went to China, in other words, to paraphrase, it's kind of dangerous, don't you think? Like the Chinese government can very quickly nationalize the businesses / profits of these powers that be that just move their operations there. China doesn't seem to play ball.
Yeah, that's why they don't want to go right to germ warfare, because Americans own such a big part of the Chinese economy. It's international capital.
I see. Okay. So it really doesn't really make sense to like speak of countries anymore. It's more like, where is the current manufacturing and financial industry concentrated, where it's deriving its profits from? And currently it's not the United States.
Yeah. That was Trump's point, that the United States lost its essential power and has been living on money manipulation since it exported its industry.
Right.
Can I read one quote from William H. Gates, his book, Showing Up for Life? He says, every corner we've turned in the field of global health, we found that the Rockefellers were already there and had been there for years. When we committed to childhood immunization, we found ourselves building on the efforts the Rockefeller Foundation had helped launch and fund in the 1980s, ... And we learned that such goals are not prizes claimed by the short-winded. The Rockefellers stay with tough problems for generations. And so this is just like we talk about. I think of you, Ray, as following in this tradition of great scientists, and William H. Gates and his son are following in the great or the terrible shadow of these eugenicists. And so, but people think or are trained to think that there's no patterns to any of this, and that it's all random, and that you shouldn't investigate these things.
Someone sent me a letter they had from some government official denouncing the people who asked questions and suggested fraud. They said that you aren't experts, we aren't experts, we have to listen to the expert opinion. But the trouble is, who picks those experts? The mindless crooks are defined as top scientists by the financial world.
We can move on to health stuff after this. I did get many requests for us to talk about like the esoteric part of the elite. And so I have on screen here the Jacob Rothschild with the Marina Abramovich women. And so, like, there's clearly some element of mysticism or like Luciferianism or religious context for a lot of the things the elites do. And I asked you a long time ago, and you said it was more of like a window dressing thing. But
more of a what?
Window dressing.
Yeah. I think the real philosophy. It's worse than any of the Christian heresies or demonisms and such. I think it's the belief that they can encode reality, and that reality is computable and controllable, basically by defining it as a quantized, digitizable something. In other words, an absolute Mendelism or idealism, far beyond these little cultish ideas, but it's a seeing of reality as lacking everything that you feel as a living part of experience. The thing that animals and kids feel, the intrinsic fluidity of being, they believe or assert that it is all absolutely at base nothing but symbols and digitizable symbols. So everything reduces to isolated quanta of existence, and these ultimately are explainable only by randomness.
So in other words, reality is fully computable, right?
Absolutely. That started being the explicit language in the 1930s. And by the 1950s, it had become such a religion that people like Norbert Wiener and Vannevar Bush, who believed in an analog approach to cybernetics and reality, in which all of the in-betweens exist and are meaningful and controllable, not just the definable quantized units. Wiener and Bush were just written out of science. Wiener was ostracized at MIT pretty much the way Peter Duesberg has been at California. And meanwhile, Chomsky represented the vanguard of this mentalistic Conrad Lorentzian fascist view of reality, claiming that you don't need an experience of language. It can all be dealt with objectively as particles ultimately connected to genes, which are similar quantized units, and you can't experience them, you can infer them. So everything is abstract inference from symbols to symbols, eliminating all continuity and ultimately meaning. Chomsky was working for the Pentagon, basically financed by them, creating language schemes that would work to give organization and instructions to troops through computers, while he was posing as an anti-imperialist, anti-militarist. He was socializing with top people in the Pentagon, even supported a Pentagon guy as chancellor of MIT. And Norbert Wiener was going into obscurity because of supporting a holistic view of cybernetics and reality.
So, do you think that some of the reasons behind this push to really restrict life and what people are allowed to do and how they're allowed to behave and really like the way their consciousness functions, some of the reasons behind that push is because I guess they quickly realized that computers are really powerless at emulating intelligence in its full richness and fluidity. So they said, well, guess what? We're just going to make people behave like computers, and then it'll be a lot more easier to emulate them. And we're going to call it a success because the computer will be able to emulate the human, but the human is no longer a human. It's acting like a computer.
Exactly right. It's all authoritarianism put into an ideology of idealism.
I just want to point out that they're standing in front of Sir Thomas Lawrence, Satan summoning his legions. And I thought I looked at it and it looked I didn't know who the painting was, and it looked a little like William Blake to me. And then I realized it, of course, wasn't. And Blake's Satan calling up his legions by Blake is about 1,000 times better. But yeah, and then we don't have to dwell on it. But the Gates implantable quantum dot microneedle uses an enzyme called luciferase. And so do you think this is like a way of more of a way of control? Like, didn't Michael Aquino, like the temple of Set and the temple of Satan? And so that might, if you tell a person, the elite, their doctrine is to do whatever you feel, like that's a perfect way to get people in really compromising situations.
Just the fact that you can get them to submit to the treatment, everything is over then. If they submit to it, there's no need to even use the technology because they're already victimized.
I have a question about William Blake. In one of your articles, you said that you were teaching some students. All of you, the class was reading the poem, and then you were asking them what they thought Blake meant, and they all gave you like really bizarre answers that you thought were like because they were damaged by the school system and they couldn't really see what Blake really meant. Do you remember that occurrence and what the discussion was about?
No, I don't remember the conversation.
Okay.
Lots of published critics have superficially Blake used language, ironically, used the language of the angels, by whom he meant satanic powers, but he called it the angels inverting things. And a lot of critics have totally misunderstood what he was saying, totally blind to the meaning of what he was saying, and thought he was on the side of the angels, who he was describing as satanic sadists.
So what do you think he meant? There's a famous quote. What is it? God, the fox provides for himself, but God provides for the lion. That's a very famous quote. What do you think he is referring to? Is it an allegory of some sort?
Was it what?
Is it an allegory of some sort? An analogy? I mean,
no, just that reality is variable.
I see.
The lion is governed by appetite, and fox uses cleverness. The lion is physically more powerful than a fox, and it might have been slightly allegorical, but he didn't have anything against foxes or cleverness, but he did say that trickery and imposed meanings were used to enslave people.
I see. So, yeah, go ahead.
Horses of instruction was another thing, that horses are enslaved and learn their lessons, and that's analogous to people who are obedient and do their jobs.
Many mainstream critics seem to portray Blake as a religious fanatic, but my understanding of him is that he was actually highly critical of traditional Christianity. He thought that that's an image of the demons, the church and all of its structure and all the rules that it creates. Does that ring a bell? Like, as a true statement?
Yeah. That's where his ironic language. It was the whole meaning of much of what he wrote, and if you don't see that he's that the angels are Satan in the sense of evil, and that the devils are the oppressed who have the potential to rebel and save some life, like the clod and the pebble. The clod was a person who obediently accepts that God is in heaven and everything is okay, and the clod gets trampled all day, and the pebble, who is tough and resistant, takes care of himself and doesn't fall for the orders and instructions and enslavement.
So in other words, if there is truth, we will have to discover it ourselves, not to be told by some third party, be that God or whoever else is in position of power.
Yeah, if you have some of the pebble's toughness, you can get through the oppression. But currently, we aren't seeing many visible pebbles in the country.
Yeah, that's why I thought it's kind of sad, because we need pebbles in order for the toughness of the pebble in order to get through these trying times. But at the same time, it seems that the health of the younger generations has been so compromised. Things are not really looking up very good right now. I mean, there are not many pebbles, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of variable reality, I had a question here about LSD and hallucinations. And they say, is there a relationship between hallucinations and serotonin? And kind of add on to that, are the hallucinations separate from the drug's effects on the serotonin system? And so what are your thoughts on that, Ray?
The accumulating evidence for the first 15 or so years was very clear that LSD was a simple anti-serotonin action, and that serotonin in overdose can make you crazy and hallucinate, but it's a misery experience, not an enlightenment experience. And the small amounts of LSD that will oppose serotonin on blood vessels and smooth muscles, all of the visible systems of the body, LSD is protective against serotonin. And the stress experience, unavoidable stress, poisons you with serotonin, increases your tendency to be obedient, to want to be controlled from the outside, and a little bit of LSD by blocking the serotonin can open a person up, get them out of this digitized world. There are some interviews with Kerry Mullis in which he suggests that his LSD experience helped him break out of the insane science world and see the actual complexity that in looking at any sort of scientific situation, if you don't start out recognizing and assuming the infinite complexity of things, you're going to fall for all kinds of arguments. All of the mechanisms of science start seeming plausible to the degree that you accept the basic idea that the world is reducible to digitized symbols. And when you see it's a continuous, infinitely complex thing, then you can actually start looking at the data as objective data, but tremendously complex at every point, and every point needs to be point in the argument, and almost 100% of the so-called scientific literature advances without examining the meaning of almost any of their words. They pile one word and one mechanism on top of the other to arrive at some predetermined goal, and then they say that's the result of their scientific investigation. It's all essentially a kind of authoritarian religious blather.
I feel like a first-year philosophy student asking you this, but if the culture tends to increase serotonin and serotonin influences like the visual perception, are things maybe at a certain level when somebody takes LSD, are the things they're seeing more real than what a person might like see day to day? Does that make any sense?
Very often they are. It was the drug industry that caught on to the idea of promoting serotonin and tryptophan, and they wanted to get rid of that LSD idea, and so they said that if LSD makes you insane, it's because it's blocked your serotonin, and so you have to increase your serotonin to make your mind work, emotions work properly. But it was driven by the drug industry, and serotonin is really primarily a stress emergency signal and hormone.
But if a person takes like a large, I don't know what a large, maybe 100 micrograms of LSD or something, and they see the world as looking like an abstract painting, is there a way, and again, if correct me if I'm wrong, but if that is more real than what I am like currently seeing right now, like, is there a way to mimic that to some extent, or is that just not possible given kind of the environment we live in?
A lot of that is the overdose effect, but in someone like Kerry Mullis, they come back from it and realize how flexible the knowing process is. But just coffee and good health and good experience will duplicate just about everything up to that. I think the most important thing that the expanded consciousness does is to realize that consciousness extends through both time and space, that you are present in the oncoming future as well as the recent and more distant pasts. The digital civilization doesn't want people to experience themselves in that way. And when you're doing that, when you're experiencing yourself extending through time and space, you see a person's arguments and how they're mounting their argument, and usually mounting it on fraudulent assumptions and concepts, and so it helps you ask the right questions to if possible, knock their phony structure apart.
Two questions. Go ahead. One related to LSD and one to consciousness. What do you say to people who would bring up studies that show that selective serotonin antagonists, such as cyproheptadine and ketanserin, can both prevent the hallucination trip from an LSD and actually can also stop one that is already in progress? Wouldn't that sort of like give credence to the idea that the trip from LSD is somehow connected to the serotonin system?
I think some of the hallucination type experiences come from the overdose effect of LSD starting to act like ergot and serotonin and constricting blood vessels in the brain, shutting off energy production and leading to distortion of perception rather than opening and amplification.
I see, but the hallucinations are really not necessary for the positive effect of the drug to occur. They're just more of a side effect.
Not at all. They're a harmful side effect.
All right. Well, many people. Okay, that's quite a revelation, because many people who use LSD, I think a significant majority of them, I would dare say, are probably using it for specifically for the trip. They think it's what gives them this religious experience of feeling oneness with the world and the ego dissolution. But if I'm hearing it correctly, this is just a side effect. They're actually the real benefits of the drug for the opposition to serotonin, and even much lower dosages would be sufficient. There's no need to go on a trip to have this benefit.
Yes, the range of 10 to 20 micrograms is adequate for expanding consciousness.
I see. So, question related to consciousness. You said that people need to understand that consciousness extends both in space and in time. So, would it be a useful analogy to basically imagine consciousness as, let's say, if reality is a lake or like a body of water, and we throw a stone in it, so then you have these concentric rings of waves. So, would it be a correct analogy to say that consciousness is the totality of those waves, not just the place where the stone dropped, right? So it's the waves that you've been making in the past and also in the future that are converging in that central point, but the consciousness is really the totality of all of those waves that are in the lake.
Yeah. So the consciousness isn't in your head. It's never in your head if you're conscious.
Right.
Can you touch on that a little bit more? Like, you should not, like, I think a lot of people describe, like, they're thinking there's like a frontal sensation of, presence or being, but you're saying that is not what you necessarily want to feel, or you're saying something different?
Feeling being is a very complex, always changing thing. That's what one wants to do.
That actually reminded me of something else I did want to talk to you about. Like maybe in nutrition for women, you were talking about feelings in your stomach associated with happiness and things like maybe you call it your smile energy or something. Well, like what? How much in our present environment are we cut off from these types of things? And given the specific food supply, do you think maybe the real human condition is much more complex than maybe what a person experiences day to day and right now?
Yeah, your body, as it approaches other beings, these feelings from your heart and solar plexus especially, you feel connection, the sort of thing, maybe Luc Montagnier was experiencing that when he thought of how particles interact. But I think those are actual radiation-like experiences or processes in your organism that are actually interacting. When you feel that you're interacting through those nerve centers in your body, I think you are in reality interacting. There have been lots of experiments showing that sort of thing, and that's a very functional part of consciousness that is easily cut off. The frown of an authority figure will cause your solar plexus or heart plexus to shrink and wither into itself and cut you off from others. And the thing of wearing a mask and having spatial distance, that among other things, that's making you have a sense of withered biological interaction.
So when
a geometrical spacing of people through a park or building, just a horrible parody of the digitized reality that they're imposing.
So when two people are feeling, when they say, "Oh, I'm vibing with that person," you're saying that there is actually a very, very objective physical process underlying that feeling that both experience.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it based on digestion, or is it based on their consciousness somehow resonating, or is it, I guess, two sides of the same coin?
I think it's a physical resonance of those nerve nodes or plexuses in the body that they are like semi-autonomous nodules. Each one can interact in its own way, but the whole interaction of the organism comes if you have responsive organisms and aren't interfered with by the threat of authoritarian opinion.
Speaking of resonance, I'm sure, not sure, you've mentioned Rupert Sheldrake's idea several times, and he talks about the morphic resonance fields and reality being essentially a super field composed of many subfields, consciousness being one of them. What are these fields composed of? Is it like ripples in the neutrino sea? Is that what the underlying medium is?
Yeah, that's why Horace Dudley's work intrigued me. I had been reading Andrea Puharich's things on the magic mushrooms and his orgone accumulator experiments and so on. And Puharich was believing that the autonomic nervous system was creating a vortex in some kind of an ether that would, in a particular state, it would draw in contact with others, regardless of distance. And Michael Persinger sees it in terms of electromagnetic waves, but I prefer the Horace Dudley idea that the neutrino sea is fundamental. It's the subquantic medium.
So, do you think Cameron's work on seriality touches upon that, even though he viewed it more abstractly? In other words, these waves of similar events that we're seeing, they're just a physical manifestation of those fields, of overlapping fields that Sheldrake is talking about?
That who is talking about?
Sheldrake. So the serial events, the synchronicity that Carl Jung spoke about, and Kammerer actually tried to define more scientifically, they were both essentially talking about these same overlapping fields that Sheldrake sort of defined 100 years later more accurately.
Yeah, I think Sheldrake sometimes lapses over into slight idealism rather than something substantial like electromagnetic fields and neutrino sea under the fields.
Okay, so I've read some of Sheldrake's work, and he talks about how like a specific group of people have a collective memory because of their similarity, whether that's physiological or cultural or whatnot. So if, let's say, if a member of the group learns something, then the rest of the members would, if they try to learn the same thing, would be easier because they will be drawing on that sort of like field that the person has created with their own consciousness. Why would this be limited to a specific culture or a group of people? Why wouldn't it be a universal field that everybody contributes to?
I think it's the partly the interaction that has a tuning effect. People are embedded in the authoritarian culture, which has a suppressive, dividing effect, and small groups can create a somewhat private culture that gives them some freedom from the big authoritarian process. And the authoritarian larger culture, American, European, the historic things that have gone on for thousands of years, having some common properties, assumptions, those things suppress the biological connectedness. But when you have a geographical interaction, I think that just like the health interactions, when you have a certain like visible people around you, that lets you tune into each other and momentarily forget the outside interferences.
I'm sure you're familiar with the ideas of Native Americans about every person having a totem, like a guardian animal. But they also, apparently, their culture also has this what do you call it, myth or not, doesn't matter. But the idea that you can actually draw on the experience of any animal that basically that your group has associated in the past with. So you can essentially learn. You can teach yourself to behave like a bear, live like a bear, and even see the world like a bear. Do you think the lack of restrictions in those cultures are what allowing people to draw from the collective consciousness that includes both animals and people?
Oh yeah, I think our real society includes our animal neighbors as well as our human neighbors, often more. If the animals, the birds, for example, birds seem very aware when someone is different from the pack. They sort of hang around and wonder what's happening.
So, what doesn't that give a little bit of credibility to the argument that vegans would say? We're like, well, we don't eat meat because we don't want to eat sentient beings. Now, of course, it's a little bit duplicitous because plants are also sentient beings, so you have to be eating something at some point. But don't you think that the moral argument of not wanting to eat animals, doesn't that give it a little bit of credibility because those are essentially human? They're not human, but they're beings like us.
Of course, when you look at food cosmically, looking at the nature of cosmic energy produced by fusion, presumably, or whatever it is that makes stellar energy flowing through substances, the process of nutrition, you should see it in that cosmic dimension, and it happens that the safest nutrition for long life and clear consciousness, unstressed consciousness, happens to be fruit and milk. The milk purifies nutrients and rebalances them in an anti-stress way. And with a selection of fruits, the fruit is designed to nourish its seeds or to feed an animal that will distribute the seeds. So the seeds would be unethical to eat, and the body of the fruit would be an absolute positive thing in the cosmic flow of energy.
What about eggs? Would eggs be okay in that framework of thought?
Less ideal, but still no sentient process Beakov has developed.
Okay. Well,
that reminds me of I think somebody wrote you a long time ago, and I think they were contemplating suicide or something. And you wrote them something to the effect of, you have to realize there's lots of intelligence left in the world. It's just not human intelligence. Something to that effect. Okay, let's take a mild break here, guys. We have, I don't know how many people are watching this at the moment, but give this episode a like. Huge thank you to Ray. Huge thank you to Georgie. These episodes are always super special, so I appreciate it. And Ray, can you just let everybody know how to order your newsletter?
Email raypeachsnewsletter@gmail.com.
And then I just got the novel flu one a few weeks ago. And so, yeah, you're sending those out via email. I get that question all the time. Unless you had any more big questions, I guess we could go through some like logistical supplement food related questions, Georgie.
Well, I mean, the question about PUFA and Lipofuscin?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Ray, I don't know. I think there's like a secondhand quote from somebody else, but maybe you said something to the effect of, by the time a person is 30, they have enough PUFA to last a lifetime. Well, one, is that accurate? And then two, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Just it's even more important to keep the total polyunsaturated fat pretty low. Right? Hey.
I don't think I understood the question.
I guess okay, just this statement: by the time a person is 30, they have as much polyunsaturated fat in their tissue to last a lifetime. So
that seems to presume that there's some use for polyunsaturated fat. I see them as harmful right from the start. A well-fed, healthy mother, they when they analyze a newborn's brain, the conventional science says they're all born with a PUFA deficiency, an essential fatty acid deficiency. No, that's the healthy, very high metabolizing brain that has been protected against PUFA by the placenta. But as soon as breastfeeding stops, or if they start using a formula that has added PUFA, the brain starts assimilating it, forming esters of cholesterol that accumulate, ultimately causing atherosclerosis, but accumulating in the brain and other tissues, slowing metabolism, so that constantly, exactly as the cholesterol ester content of PUFA increases, the metabolic rate decreases, and that it simply, by the age of 30 or 40, it's reaching the point that it is causing aging symptoms to set in, and it progresses with the onset of a cold brain, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. The cholesterol ester content of the brain is becoming extreme and blocking metabolism progressively.
Go ahead. You're right. That it's like a positive thing on the question, but I appreciate your answer. That makes sense.
I have a question. So let's say somebody's. I read a study that said that when you're eating a combination of fats, the saturated fat gets preferentially oxidized, while the PUFA gets preferentially stored in the fatty tissue. Doesn't that sort of imply that it would be really, really difficult to change your fatty acid composition through diet, because every time unless you're eating almost 100% saturated fat diet.
Under stress, the PUFA comes out preferentially, and it increases in the fat cells with aging. But that just means that when you're under stress and are releasing free fatty acids, they become more toxic the older you get, because you have more of them in the system. But they're also in the phospholipids and cholesterol esters, not just in the storage fats.
So in terms of displacing that PUFA, or increasing the ratio of saturated fat to PUFA in the tissues, I think there seems to be more. I don't want to call it more optimal, but the longer chain saturated fatty acids like palmitic acid, stearic acid, anything over chain length of carbon chain length of 14 seems to be better, because these get preferentially absorbed through the lymphatic system and they can get to the tissues, while the shorter chain fatty acids like those found in coconut oil seem to be quickly picked up by the portal vein system and get into the liver, and the liver oxidizes it. So if somebody wants to change their tissue composition, they need to be eating longer chain saturated fatty acids. Am I reading this right?
Yeah, there are quite a few studies showing a longer life in proportion to the percentage of highly saturated, completely saturated fats, and inverse cancer incidence. And do you remember the old vitamin E people were finding that the crude vitamin E had a stamina increasing effect, but it turned out when they refined it a little more, it was the very long chain saturated fats that were providing the protective athletic endurance and stamina increasing effect of wasn't the vitamin E, but the waxy material associated with it. And since refining vitamin E has eliminated those waxy, highly saturated long chain fats, the studies of vitamin E are no longer so positive.
Yeah, you mean the polycosanols, the ones that the Cubans are running studies with for cardiovascular disease? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember. Yeah, those studies seem to abruptly stop around the late 40s. The ones that talked about the wheat germ oil, the stamina effect of wheat germ oil, and then they purified it. They found out it's the long chain fats, the fatty acid alcohols, and then the Cubans started doing some research with those. And I feel like as soon as the Cubans picked up on that, because they're extracting them from sugarcane, then a whole slew of studies came out in the United States and actually in the general Western medical press saying this is a complete scam. These things do not work. This is communist science. But it seems like this is so strange because the original science happened in the United States. It was just before the 1950s.
Yeah, science is all about marketing. You just shouldn't believe 98% of the things published as science. It's everything except some cosmology and some physics. Everything else tends to be marketing.
Okay. So would you say that these extremely long chain fatty acids like the polycosanols are actually better at displacing the PUFA in the tissues?
I think so.
Okay. Do you have like a recommendation of someone, because they sell this, assuming someone can get it as a pure powder or supplement. Most of the Cuban studies say just 10 to 20 milligrams a day is enough. And that seems to be what all those studies with the unrefined vitamin E, that seems to be what a daily intake would provide. Yeah. Do you have any recommendation on specific dosages?
I think that's about the right quantity.
Okay, understood.
Ray, the ketone. Go ahead.
Well, related to the lipofuscin, but I guess you can ask about the ketone.
Ray, I just wanted to go over the ketone body ratio again because I think that is. I think the very dominant alt paradigm right now is keto, fasting, low carb, carnivore diets, and some of the big proponents in that camp and camps similar. They talk about that fasting and ketosis increase NAD relative to NADH. And given the ketone body ratio, it seems like, and they'll quote these two papers, I should have wrote them down, but that seems impossible given the limited amount of investigation I've done on the ketone body ratio. It's like so clear that go ahead.
All of the best biochemists that I know of showed that diabetes and fasting caused extreme reduction of NADH rather than NAD, a shift towards the cancer physiology.
Is that happening in every system equally? Maybe like do different systems compensate when the stress first starts to appear or something?
I think very bad biochemical technique always messes up the reduction balance analysis. Glutathione and NADH are so sensitive to conditions that I think in the last 30 years or so, most of the work published is doctrine rather than fact.
I have a little bit of clarification on that. I think most of these papers are measuring the NAD to the NADH ratio in the cytosol. And in the cancer cell, in the diabetic cell, the NAD to the NADH ratio in the cytosol of these 6 cells is actually very high because those cells are using pyruvate as an emergency oxidant and they're generating lactate. But the mitochondrial ratio of NAD to the NADH is actually very low in cancer, diabetes, and fasting. So I would like to see those papers. Where did they measure that ratio? Because even the Wikipedia page on the Randall cycle talks about fatty acid oxidation dramatically shifting the redox balance towards reduction in the mitochondria. So that seems to be already sort of like commonly accepted knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the ketones, so-called, are not ketones. The beta hydroxy butyrate, they call that a ketone body, but it's not a ketone, and it shifts cell balance the same way lactic acid does. It's a reductant.
And I know you've gone over this 100,000 times, but when somebody does benefit from a ketosis style of diet, you hypothesize maybe that it's in disinfecting their intestine possibly to some way, and maybe they're changing their food, just better quality in general.
Yeah, someone who has been eating pasta and sweet potatoes and so on, if they shift to a meat and egg and cheese diet, their intestine is going to be very happy, and for a couple of years they'll feel great.
Exactly. And just to piggyback on that, the parathyroid calcium to phosphorus, that's not that's a moment to moment thing, correct? Like if you eat a meal that is higher in phosphorus, that could turn on your parathyroid hormone for the next few hours. Is that right?
I think so. And it's a very good indicator of stress, and so the whole system that turns on aldosterone, angiotensin, renin, aldosterone, that's behind the process of increasing your parathyroid hormone. And so many kinds of stress will do it, but it happens that high phosphate is very closely connected. Calcium and vitamin D are connected in the other way, protecting against all of those pro-inflammatory, anti-metabolic things. So a high calcium diet with vitamin D seems to energize your thyroid function, because it's getting you out of that parathyroid hormone, aldosterone, angiotensin, inflammatory, reductive state.
I have a question about vitamin D. I'm sure you're aware there are plenty of studies that try to portray in a bad light. And some of the older studies show that, if you administer high doses of vitamin D, even in the absence of increased calcium intake in the diet, apparently it can cause soft tissue calcification. Do you think there is any truth to those studies, or do you think vitamin D needs a cofactor to make it work more safely, like maybe vitamin K?
A lot of them are confusing 1,25-hydroxycholecalciferol with the 25-hydroxy, and that the literature is dominated by that confusion. And if you start with clotho, the anti-aging protein, you'll see that 25-hydroxy supports clotho, and 125, the so-called active vitamin D, knocks down clotho and raises parathyroid hormone and angiotensin. All of the toxic degenerative things is done by the activated vitamin D. And there's a very massive confusion on that. People talking about active vitamin D as if it's the relevant thing, rather than being evidence of extreme stress and sickness.
But the 25 hydroxy in the body, I think in the kidney or in the liver, it gets converted into 125 hydroxy, right? So wouldn't taking a precursor like that would raise the risk?
No, it lowers it, in fact,
Oh,
by
wow.
helping you put calcium where it belongs. It will, eating calcium and vitamin D will lower parathyroid hormone and lower inflammation and raise clotho and pretty much turn off the activation in the kidneys, which happens in end-stage kidney disease, for example.
Okay.
The activation goes wild and kills a person.
What about the potential risk for hypercalcemia with high doses vitamin D? Do you think that's still tied to that confusion about calcitriol versus cholecalciferol, or do you think, yeah?
I think so. The studies I've seen with very big doses of 25-hydroxy show no harm at all up to 1 million units or something for an extended period.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a clarification. I know you've also talked about this before, but cortisol is made from progesterone, but doesn't increase it. And so when people look at those steroid synthesis charts, I think it's very confusing. And so is there an easy way of a layman grappling with the fact that when you take progesterone, it's not going to increase your cortisol levels?
Yeah, think of the connections as being like a rope. If there's a deficiency, there's a weight on the rope. It'll pull the precursor along. But no matter how much pressure you put on your end of the rope, you can't push the other end of the rope. Those charts have to be thought of holistically, and there's no pushing allowed. It's all pulling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting. And then last question for me, the progesterone DHEA ratio. And so you and I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or something, I was asking you about an amount of DHEA to use with a progesterone specifically for a male, and we had a back and forth. But you don't think that they have to be used in some specific ratio all the time? That was, I don't know. You want to?
Yeah, if someone is going to blindly use it, it would be a good idea just to have a ballpark somewhere in the ratio that you can't poison yourself with DHEA, and you can't suppress your nervous system so much that you don't make any. But a lot of people find that they increase their DHEA and testosterone just by taking progesterone, because progesterone turns off aromatase, for example.
Yeah.
And aromatase tends to waste DHEA and testosterone by grinding it through the estrogen process.
So, wouldn't basically this be a statement for in favor of using DHA with some progesterone to lower the risk of it converting into estrogen in a, let's say, hypothyroid person?
No, if you don't have any DHEA being produced, it's good to have some in your body, and so it's very often helpful all the way up for a very old person, 10 or 12 milligrams per day backed up with progesterone can be curative, can bring back tissue, connective tissue strength, and so on. Both progesterone and DHEA in a really old person can have very powerful restorative effects. But in a younger person, often the body doesn't have any problem making DHEA, and the progesterone will just help activate the thyroid and reduce the aromatase and inflammatory processes.
Well, I guess my question was, if someone were to take DHEA, it would be safer if they combine it with progesterone. Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah, because
Okay.
so many people take more DHEA than they really can use in the proper ways. And so a 30-year-old taking 10 milligrams is very likely to be producing too much estrogen from it if they happen to be slightly hypothyroid or deficient in vitamin D or under stress of some sort.
Okay. I have a question about a pregnenolone. In one of your articles and several interviews, you mentioned an old study where they fed rats the human equivalent of a cup a day. And I've been trying to find that study, and you basically said that pregnenolone essentially lowered their cortisol back to normal. Do you remember what year that study was, or where it was published, or where you saw it? Because I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I saw it in a book published, I think, 1950, edited by Abraham White.
Okay.
Ray, getting some of your references is like like an investigation of like many months. Like I know you provide a significant amount, but sometimes you'll mention something and it will literally take me like a year to find eventually. But like without Sci-Hub, I wouldn't be able to find anything. You know, like Sci-Hub. Are you familiar with that, Ray?
Without what?
Sci-Hub, SCI-Hub, HUB, basically the pirate website to download articles.
Oh.
Well, anyways, that's like a huge boon to, I think, anybody with an active interest in this field. But yeah, anyways, it's very fun tracking down some of the things you mentioned, finding them in old books and such. So let me read through these super chats and then we can wrap this up. Linda Bell for $5. Thank you so much. She says, good evening. Lisa Ferraro for $9.99. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Linda. Lisa says, I love these conversations between Ray, Georgie, and Danny. Thank you guys. Please keep having them. Thanks for that, Lisa. Pure Therapy for $4.99. And he has a dancing GIF emoji. Thanks for that, Pure Therapy. Tone. We won't be able to get to questions here because I'd feel bad because we never answer questions on here. Here for $20 though. Thank you, Tone. Sincerely appreciate it. Harry Burgos for $25. Thank you, Harry. And Michelle for $50. Wow, that's a lot. And he says, let's not be trodden with cattle's feet. Go Pebbles. Thank you for that, Michelle. I sincerely appreciate it. And I'll forward these directly to Ray. George, you have any final questions for Ray?
One last question on Lipofuscin.
Yes.
Because I think that's...
Go for it.
So we talked about PUFA accumulation with age, and let's say like eating longer chain saturated fatty acids can over time displace it. But would that take care of Lipofuscin, Ray? Because my impression from the studies that I've been reading is that once it forms inside the cell, you'll have to take some kind of a solvent. And there's some studies on potentially vitamin E or even alcohol. Drinking alcohol can potentially help with that. But yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting. They were in nerve cells. They were studying vitamin E's ability to disintegrate lipofuscin, and they were dissolving the vitamin E in ethanol, and so they tested plain ethanol, and it worked just almost as well as the vitamin E with ethanol, and that got me interested in its antioxidant action. It takes something like a teaspoonful of ethanol per day to have a very powerful antioxidant effect. I learned that in physics and some very sensitive engineering where they are using transistors and such and need to be free of free radicals. Just a tiny amount of ethanol vapor is a powerful anti-free radical agent.
So would those be the safest things for potentially dissolving lipofuscin until more is known? Vitamin E and a tiny bit of ethanol, maybe like one drink a day?
Years ago, I saw people who were they had a fried appearance from so much age pigment, and taking progesterone, within a few weeks, their skin looked restored and normal. So I think if you turn off estrogen very efficiently, you stop making it, and your body can clear it up. That person that I first saw it happen in was in her 40s, and I think there's still enough good thyroid metabolism going that progesterone could be the catalyst suppressing estrogen and shifting the balance away from formation towards elimination.
Understood. One final question. What is your general opinion of the steroidal, and I emphasize steroidal, aromatase inhibitors? Would they have any place in any kind of like a compromised health condition, or do you think progesterone can offer everything they could and do that more safely?
They have side effects, and I don't think there's been a great effort to explore why those side effects happen. And so I think maybe in 20 years more will be known, but I think they're good to avoid and use any of the known very effective anti-aromatase. Even the angiotensin receptor blockers are pretty effective. Lots of things inhibit aromatase. Anything that stops the basic inflammatory oxygen deprivation process.
Okay. Well, final question. In one of your recent emails with a person, they forwarded to me, you spoke about eugenol and of its potentially, it's like a great spectrum of beneficial effects. And I looked at the molecule, and it reminds me a lot of dopamine. Do you think eugenol has some of those effects on the nervous system, kind of pro-dopamine, anti-serotonin?
Oh, I don't know. There are some good effects seen with it, but I haven't used enough to really have an opinion.
Okay. All right. That's it. I don't have anything else.
Ray, what are you working on right now?
Oh, thinking about how education is going to be affected by the takeover lockdown mentality, with people like Governor Cuomo putting Eric Schmidt to work at converting from real education to digital education. I think some thought needs to be given to how actual, real, living education might be protected against this authoritarian pseudo, using digital systems to apply indoctrination and call it education.
There were a few requests for us to talk about Jonathan Taylor Gatto. I'm sorry, I screwed up the name, but maybe we can save that for next time, because that is a huge topic. So I'm glad you brought it up. Ray, do you have any parting words for everybody? I think 150 or so people are listening right now.
No.
Awesome, Ray. Thank you so much. These are always fun to do. Georgie Dinkov, thank you so much. And we'll be back next month. Thank you guys for watching. I have an amazing audience. We're very fortunate. So thank you guys so much, and have a safe weekend, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.